Welcome back to Harsh Rules. I'm Ben Harsh, and today we're going to learn to play the first volume of the fast action battle game series, The Bulge. FAB, The Bulge, was released in 2008 by G&T Games and designed by Rick Young. This game supports up to 2 players and takes about 4 hours to play. Before we begin this episode, I'd like to recognize the Harsh Rules Patreon supporters that help make content like this possible. If you'd like to support the channel, head over to patreon.com/harshrules to learn more. And once again, thank you for your support. Another way you can support the channel is by liking and subscribing. Liking a video helps me understand what content is successful with this audience. As for subscribing, new content appears on this channel first. While you may have found your way here from Board Game Geek or other sites, in the future I'll also be adding more exclusive content that may only be found here. The best way to be informed when I upload new videos is to subscribe and click the bell icon for notifications. Once again, thanks for watching, and now let's get to the video. Before we jump in, to get the most out of this rules breakdown, it's critical to understand the terminology for the following game pieces. I'm going to reference these numerous times throughout the video, so it's important to know the differences between them. The main combat and maneuver elements are wooden blocks called units. Units may have special designations such as airborne or mountain infantry. However, the rules will always treat units as either armor or infantry. Assets are cardboard counters that represent small fighting formations, engineers, and artillery. Events are also counters, but are not to be confused with assets. Events represent historical and logistical high command actions that include replacements, air missions, special actions, and other battle occurrences. It's also important to note the reusable special action is a block. This block is merely a reminder that this special action can be reused, where counters are used once and then eliminated. Now, with that refresher out of the way, let's get started by learning the sequence of play. Fast action battle games like The Bulge utilize the following turn structure. First, both players receive new reinforcements. Then, each player will take their turn, starting with the German player and continuing on to the US player. Finally, both players will conduct the supply phase. Now, let's walk through each of these steps to understand the sequence of play. The reinforcement phase allows players to deploy reinforcement unit blocks to the game map and add new and used asset and event counters to a selection pool. Players will later draw from this counter pool to update their options to support armies on the game map. To manage this counter pool, each player will need a selection cup. This game does not come with any actual cups, but players can use any opaque cup or draw bag of their choice. Once counters are drawn into play, their status is tracked by 3 resource boxes. First, counters drawn from the selection cup are placed in the available box. Then, players take asset and event counters from the available box and play them on the game map. After players finish using asset counters like infantry, armor, engineers, and artillery, they are returned to the used box. However, when event counters are spent on the game map, they are moved to the eliminated box. Unit and asset casualties are also placed in the eliminated box, with the exception of large units that have 3 or more steps. These are placed on the large unit track for a victory point each. Now that we understand how the resource boxes work, let's walk through the steps of the reinforcement phase. The reinforcement phase is conducted in 6 steps. These steps are printed in the available box and used box. When working your way through the numbered list, you'll need to jump from the available box to the used box and vice versa. Now, step 1 and 2 are used to manage a special action block, which is a reusable game piece. The special action block arrives with other reinforcements in turn 2 for both sides and begins in the available box. Unlike other blocks, This one remains in the resource boxes throughout the game. These two steps are all about managing its position. This block can be spent during a player's turn to perform several actions. We'll review those game effects when opportunities become available in the sequence of play. For now, let's look at managing its availability for use. So in step 1 of the reinforcement phase, the player will check for its position. If the special action block is in the available box, meaning it wasn't spent in the last turn, the player receives a bonus. They can move any one asset from the used box back to the available box. The special action block is not spent to take this bonus and remains in the available box. Therefore, if the player spends the special action block during the turn, they move it to the used box and lose the bonus. That's where step 2 takes effect. If the special action block is in the used box, move it back to the available box. This makes it available to use again during the current turn. Or the player can save it to get the bonus, as we just saw. Next, let's look at step 3, which is only for the German player. Every reinforcement phase, they must take one standard artillery asset from their used box and place it in the eliminated box. You'll notice that the German player has two different types of artillery assets: standard artillery and rocket artillery. Only eliminate one standard artillery asset if it's in the used box. This rule is based on history that as the German line advanced into the Ardennes, they had a difficult time maintaining standard artillery support. Therefore, as the game progresses, standard artillery for the Germans is in constant decline. Once this bit of artillery housekeeping for the Germans is resolved, it's time to move to step 4. In this step, for both players, move all the remaining used assets to the selection cup. Then it's on to step 5 and 6, which has to do with reinforcements. So let's take a look at how that works next. In the reinforcement phase, each player checks their reinforcement card. This card is organized by turn and tells the player which units, the game's blocks, to add to the game board, and which assets and events, the cardboard counters, to add to their selection cup. Placing reinforcements on the game map is simple. Each side has several entry areas designated to place units. Entry areas are marked with a color-coded band and a letter. Areas with a green band are for the US and gray bands for the Germans. Be sure to place the units in the area on the map, the actual territory, and not the band itself. Placing units as reinforcements does not cost movement points. Each reinforcement block has a number and a letter printed in the corner. The number refers to the turn the reinforcement becomes available. The letter tells you the reinforcement area to place the block. If a block has multiple letters, this is a range of options that the player can choose to place the reinforcement. Remember, each area has a stacking limit of 2 units. Placing a reinforcement cannot violate this stacking limit. Also, reinforcements cannot be placed in an area occupied by the enemy. If a reinforcement unit is blocked from its entry area, its arrival is delayed 1 turn. The reinforcement will then arrive at the nearest allowed appropriate entry area. Once all block reinforcements are placed on the game map, put all the reinforcement assets and events into the selection cup. Then, it's time to move to the next phase. After the reinforcement phase, the game progresses to individual player turns, beginning with the Germans. The first phase of a player's turn is the admin phase. In this phase, both players will draw counters of assets and events from their selection cup and place them in their available box. That's right, I said both players. Although this is the German turn, the US player will also be drawing from their selection cup as well. Each player has a specific limit of counters they can draw per admin phase, whether it's the German turn or the US turn. This limit can be found at the bottom of each numbered space on the turn track. You'll notice that there are 3 colored boxes. The gray box is for the German counter draw, and the green box is for the US counter draw. The yellow box is not related to drawing counters. These are the net victory point thresholds for calculating a sudden death victory. So ignore the yellow box for now. When referencing the gray German turn box, the first number is the amount of counters the German player draws during their turn, and the second number the amount they draw during the US turn. The green box follows this pattern. First, the number of counters drawn during the German turn, and then the US turn. Once the appropriate number of counters are drawn from the selection cup and placed in the available box, the remainder of the admin phase is dedicated to placing engineer assets and events. However, to fully grasp this concept, we first need to understand how higher military echelons govern counter placement. So let's take a look at those game mechanics next. Each side's military forces are divided between the higher echelons involved in the operation. These higher echelons are color-coded to organize game pieces. The Germans have 3 higher echelons involved in the Battle of the Bulge. The 6th Panzer, color-coded purple, the 5th Panzer, which is gray, and the 7th Army, which is light blue. For US higher echelons, when the game begins, the 1st Army is holding the line against the Germans, and their color is light green. Later, the 3rd Army, dark green, and strategic reserves, light blue, will enter the board by way of reinforcement areas. Block units for these forces, whether they be infantry or armor units, all share their higher echelon's color. When players take resources from their available box and place them on the game board, they must follow the higher echelons they belong to. For example, each German higher echelon has engineer assets. However, these assets can only be assigned to their higher echelon color. The same rules apply for other assets as well as events. Higher echelon colors must be matched to units in that area to play them. One exception to this rule for the US player is for their strategic reserves. Strategic reserves units, assets, and events may be mixed with and/or attached to other US higher echelons without penalties. Strategic reserve units may also receive events and assets from either of the other US higher echelons without penalty. However, they may not be given both in a combat round unless the command staff asset has been used for that battle. We'll talk more about US strategic reserves later in this tutorial. The Germans also have additional higher echelon requirements. To receive assets, German higher echelons must adhere to their army's boundaries. The areas within each army's boundaries are collectively called that army's zone. These higher echelon zones trace back to the entry areas for reinforcements and also serve as supply lines. Keep this in mind for the supply phase that comes at the end of the turn. German units will need to be able to trace back to these entry areas to remain in supply. US units do not need to adhere to operational ranges. They are, after all, defending the Ardennes, not invading it. However, to remain in supply, US forces must be able to trace an uninterrupted supply line back to their entry areas. Keep this in mind because essentially, this is where supporting assets are coming from. Therefore, if a supply line is cut off, a player's forces not only lose supply, but also their assets. Now that we understand asset placement a little better, let's look at the remaining options for the admin phase, placing units and playing events. A big part of the Bulge's strategy for the Germans is breaking through the First Army's line and crossing the board before US reinforcements come pouring in. Getting German units across areas using roads and bridges makes engineer assets on both sides critical. While engineer assets can be used to fight alongside other units as battle assets, their greatest advantage is their special engineer abilities. Next, we're going to take a look at each of these. When placed in a friendly controlled area with a river boundary, an engineer can blow its bridges. All river boundaries are assumed to have a primary bridge that allow units to cross to an adjacent area. An engineer unit can blow up 2 bridges in an area. Once this action is announced, place a blown bridge marker on the affected river boundaries and move the engineer asset to the used box. Likewise, engineers can also repair bridges. This action can remove one blown bridge marker on a river boundary. However, it requires the player to control the area on one side of the river boundary and control or at least contest the area on the other side. The friendly controlled area that the engineer is repairing from must be both supplied and uncontested. Once the repair action is announced, remove the blown bridge marker and place the engineer asset in the used box. An engineer may also place a fieldworks marker, which is a defensive barrier, on any supplied, friendly controlled, uncontested area. That area must also contain at least one friendly unit from the same higher echelon. Once the action is announced, add a fieldworks marker to the area and place the engineer asset in the use box. By placing a roadblock in an area, the first enemy unit to enter must pay an additional movement point and their movement ends. The roadblock marker is removed when an enemy unit pays the penalty, a friendly unit enters the area, or during the supply phase of the same player's turn. So basically, this is a temporary way to slow units down. Roadblocks can be built in any supplied, friendly controlled, and vacant area that has a terrain difficulty of 1 or higher. Once the action is announced, add a roadblock marker to the area and place the engineer asset in the used box. A defended roadblock is essentially a roadblock marker replaced with the engineer asset itself. The difference is that when an enemy unit enters the area, they stop but do not remove the engineer asset. Instead, this triggers combat. During combat, the defender cannot use a special action to reinforce or retreat and can only add one artillery asset from the same higher echelon. Also, no events can be played. If the defending engineer survives until the supply phase, then they are placed in the used box. We covered a quick overview of events in the first episode of this series. The admin phase is where players may take events from their available box and play them in the game. Similar to assets, many of these are color-coded to specific higher echelons. However, unlike assets, which may be recycled to the selection cup, when an event is resolved, it is often placed directly in the eliminated box. And that's the basics around playing events. Next, we're going to take a look at British units and US and German reserves. If you're the German player, you may have noticed some assets and 4 block units with an orange background. These are German reserve units. When placing the appropriate counters and blocks on the reinforcement card, these orange military symbol blocks have their own spaces. On turn 5 and turn 8, the German player will receive events that when spent can bring an individual reserve block into the game into any German release area. This would be areas X, Y, or Z. This gameplay mechanic emulates support units that were held back by German command and released piecemeal to commanders late in the campaign. Reserve units also have additional special abilities. They do not pay a 2 movement point penalty when crossing an operational boundary, and they may have assets attached to them with the higher echelon color of the zone they're in. However, if occupying an area with another German unit that is also out of its zone, they can only attach artillery assets. German reserve units also have a few of their own orange events. These events function in a similar manner to their counterparts available to the other echelons. Keep these rules in mind when drawing these events from the selection cup. For the US player, British forces become available as reinforcements from turn 6. Be aware though, British units and assets must remain in their own operational areas in the northwest corner of the board, specifically from Area 57 in the north to Area 96 in the west. Essentially, this limits their operation to the northwest of the Meuse River. Remember, in actual history, the Germans were not able to cross this river. Therefore, the British forces act as a last line of defense for the Allies. Next, let's discuss the U.S. strategic reserves. This higher echelon is color-coded light blue and arrives in the game by way of reinforcements. It is comprised of 3 airborne infantry blocks, a single airborne infantry battle asset, 8 engineer units, battle assets called task forces, and garrisons that already begin the game on the board. Allied air missions are also part of this higher echelon group. The advantage of U.S. strategic reserves is that these units, assets, and events may be mixed with and/or attached to other U.S. higher echelons without the usual mixed echelon penalties. And strategic reserve units may receive events and assets from either of the U.S. higher echelons without penalty. However, they may not be given both in a combat round unless the combat staff asset has been used for that battle. Now, let's discuss the unique game pieces for this group, the garrison assets placed in St. Vith, Wiltz, Spa, and Bastogne during setup. These assets do not move from their setup area of placement until they're eliminated. If fought on their own, they act as defended roadblocks, except that they never are sent to the use box. When defeated, they are moved to the eliminated box. Garrison units also cannot retreat from combat. Therefore, units fighting alongside the garrison can retreat, but this action destroys the garrison. Garrisons are eliminated by taking a single hit, by remaining behind during retreat from combat, or by failing an unsupplied morale check. Garrison units may not be returned by the alternate event use. And that's the differences for how the U.S. Strategic Reserve's higher echelon functions in this game. Okay, we've covered a lot in this episode. It's time to take a break and absorb what we've learned. Before you go though, make sure you're subscribed with notifications because in the next episode, we're going to go deeper into the area game mechanics with operational movement, then strategic movement, and finally combat. So keep your eyes peeled for that episode. If you found this video helpful, please give me a like and share with your friends. To be the first notified when the next episode of Harsh Rules becomes available, please hit the bell icon for notifications. And as always, this has been Harsh for Harsh Rules. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you on the next video.